the single silver dollar landed on the worn pine counter with a soft, final thud. It was tarnished around the edges, the face of Lady Liberty smoothed by the passage of 1,000 pockets, and it was the last dollar Jonah Wells owned in the world. He stood in the lobby of the Harmony Creek Inn, a place that looked as tired as he felt. Dust motes danced in the bars of late afternoon sun slanting through the grimy front window. The air was thick with the oppressive heat of a Nevada summer in 1878, smelling of baked earth and stale cooking oil. Behind the counter, a woman watched him. She was small, with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. A dark green prairie dress, practical and unadorned, did little to soften the rigid set of her shoulders. She was Chinese, a rarity in this part of the territory, and judging by the ledger open before her, she was the one in charge. "I need a room." Jonah's voice was a low rasp, dry as the alkali flats he'd just crossed. "The cheapest one you've got." His appearance was a proclamation. He was dressed head to toe in black, not the fine black cloth of a gambler, but the sun-bleached, trail-worn black of a man who lived in the saddle. The dust of 3 territories seemed to be ground into the fabric of his shirt and trousers. A black hat, its brim wide and flat, shadowed his face, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion etched around his eyes. A gun belt, heavy and oiled, was slung low on his hips, the walnut grip of his Colt a dark promise against his thigh. He was the kind of man who made folks nervous, the kind who was either running from something or riding toward it. The woman, my fen, looked from the dollar to his face. She saw the reputation he wore like a second skin, but she also saw the fine lines of fatigue that spoke of days without rest and the slight tremor in the hand he rested on the counter. She had seen men like him before. They blew into town like a storm, spent their money on whiskey and cards, and blew out again, leaving nothing behind but trouble. But there was something else in his gaze, a deep, profound weariness that went beyond the trail. It was a look she recognized. It was the look of a soul that had been scoured clean of everything but the will to keep moving. Her husband, Thomas, had died a year ago, taken by a fever that had burned through him in 3 short days. He had been a good man, a carpenter who had built this inn with his own hands and married her despite the town's disapproving stares. He had left her with the property, a right her widowhood afforded her, but also with a precarious foothold in a town that had never fully accepted her. Now, she was alone, fighting to keep the business afloat against the quiet, persistent pressure of Bartholomew Thorne, the freight boss who wanted her land and made no secret of it. Thorne owned the town's ear and most of its debt. He was squeezing her with inflated invoices and veiled threats, waiting for her to break. She looked at the key hooks behind her. The cheapest room was number 7, a windowless box at the back of the inn that smelled of mildew and was suffocating in this heat. It was a room for men who had nothing left to lose. But giving him that room felt like a surrender, an admission that this was all her inn was good for now, a last stop for broken men. Instead, her hand moved to a different key. Number 3. The corner room on the 2nd floor. It had 2 windows, one facing the main street and one facing east, perfectly positioned to catch the morning sun and, more importantly, the rare evening cross breeze. It was her best room, the one she saved for traveling merchants or the territorial judge. She slid the brass key across the counter. "Room 3, she said, her voice soft but clear. "Up the stairs, last door on the left." Jonah's eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't missed the direction of her first glance toward the cheaper keys. "I said the cheapest." "The price is the same today," my fen replied, her expression unreadable. She pushed the silver dollar back toward him. "You can pay me in the morning. Dinner is at 6, if you want it." He stared at the key, then at her. He was accustomed to suspicion, to fear, to the greedy welcome of a saloon keeper smelling money. He was not accustomed to this. It felt like a trick, but he was too bone-weary to search for the angle. He picked up the key, its metal cool against his skin, and turned without another word. The jingle of his spurs was the only sound as he climbed the creaking stairs. My fen watched him go, her heart pounding a little faster. It was a foolish gamble. He could rob her blind and be gone before sunrise. But Bartholomew Thorne was a slow, creeping rot, and she knew she couldn't fight him with ledgers and polite refusals forever. She had looked at the gunslinger and made a different kind of calculation. She had not bought a night's protection. She had bet a single night of comfort and dignity against the slim chance that it might be remembered. It was a desperate move, born of a quiet desperation that no one in Harmony Creek ever bothered to see. The next morning, the trouble started early. Jonah was halfway through a cup of my friend's surprisingly good coffee when the shouting began out front. He moved to the window, his movements economical and smooth, and looked down onto the street. A massive freight wagon, one of Thorne's, was stopped directly in front of the inn's entrance, its rear wheel canted at an unnatural angle. Two of Thorne's men were making a great show of examining it, their voices loud and laced with performative frustration. They were deliberately blocking her business, turning away a family in a buckboard who had been about to stop. My friend stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her face a pale, still mask. Jonah watched her. She did not yell or plead. She simply stood her ground, a silent, defiant statue in a green dress. A few minutes later, Bartholomew Thorne himself rode up. He was a big man with a florid face and a voice that boomed with false bonhomie. He dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men, and approached my friend with a look of deep concern. "Mrs. Riley," he said, loud enough for the gathering onlookers to hear. "What a terrible bit of luck. It seems my boys have had a breakdown. Right in your way, too. I do apologize." "It is an inconvenience, Mr. Thorne," my friend said, her voice level. "Indeed. An innkeeper's life is full of them, isn't it?" Thorne's smile was oily. "Especially for a woman on her own. It's a heavy burden. I've told you, my offer to buy this place still stands. It would take this weight right off your shoulders." He was playing to the crowd, painting himself as the concerned benefactor and her as a helpless widow in over her head. Jonah saw the townsfolk watching, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were waiting to see her fold. He set his coffee cup down and walked out onto the porch. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned against a post, his thumbs hooked in his belt, and watched. The air seemed to shift. Thorne's men, who had been posturing and cursing, fell quiet. The onlookers shuffled their feet. The presence of the man in black changed the geometry of the scene. Thorne's eyes flickered toward Jonah, his smile tightening. "You have a new guest, I see." "He is a paying customer, Mr. Thorne," my friend said. Jonah ignored them both. He pushed himself off the post and walked down the steps, moving with a lazy grace that belied the speed he was capable of. He walked directly to the broken wheel and crouched down, examining the axle. The two freight men took an involuntary step back. After a moment, Jonah stood up and turned, not to Thorne, but to the crowd. He pointed a long finger at the axle pin. "Linchpin's not broken," he said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. "It was pulled. You can see the scrape marks where the pliers grabbed it." A murmur went through the onlookers. They weren't fools. They knew what that meant. This was no accident. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. Thorne's face went from ruddy to purple. He had been exposed, his petty bullying laid bare for the whole town to see. "Now, see here," Thorne sputtered, but the narrative was already lost. Jonah looked at the two freight men. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He just looked at them. "Fix it," he said. It was not a request. The men scrambled for their tools, their earlier bravado completely gone. They worked with a frantic, clumsy energy, avoiding Jonah's gaze. Within 10 minutes, the wheel was back on, and the wagon was lumbering down the street. Thorne, his face a thundercloud, mounted his horse and glared at Jonah. It was a look that promised retribution. As he wheeled his horse around to leave, Jonah's eyes caught a detail he hadn't noticed before, a small, distinctive brand on the horse's flank, a circle with a jagged line through it. His blood went cold. It was the same brand he'd seen on the horses of the men who had ambushed a silver transport stagecoach near the Arizona border 2 weeks prior. He'd been scouting for the stage line at the time, and had arrived just after the robbery. The ambush had been brutal, leaving 2 guards dead. He now understood. Bartholomew Thorne wasn't just a town bully trying to intimidate a widow. He was a violent criminal, a man who ran a freight line as a cover for organized robbery. And Jonah had just made himself Thorne's personal enemy. That evening, the inn was quiet. The confrontation had scared off what little business my friend might have had. She and Jonah sat at a small table in the empty dining room, a single lantern casting a warm, golden glow between them. She had insisted on making him dinner as thanks, a simple but flavorful meal of chicken and rice. For a long time, they ate in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but a restful one. Finally, Jonah looked up from his plate. "Why'd you do it?" he asked. "Give me the best room for $1 I didn't even have to pay." My friend set down her chopsticks, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "My husband Thomas used to say you can judge a person's character by how they treat those who can do nothing for them." She met his gaze directly. "But I am a businesswoman, Mr. Wells. It was also a calculation. I saw the way you carried yourself. You were tired of fighting, but you had not forgotten how. I wagered that a man who was given a moment of peace might be willing to defend it." Her honesty was as sharp and clean as a shard of glass. It stripped away all pretense. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a survivor, using the only tools she had, her perception and a willingness to take a calculated risk. "Thorne's been after this place since my husband died," she continued, her voice losing none of its composure. "He pressures my suppliers, overcharges me for freight, and spreads rumors that I am failing. He wants the land. It's the best-sited property on Main Street." She stood and walked to the front desk, returning with a leather-bound folder. She opened it on the table. Inside was the deed to the Harmony Creek Inn, the paper crisp and the ink bold. It was legally filed in the name of my friend Riley. Her widowhood gave her that power, a small island of legal standing in a world that sought to diminish her. Beside it, she laid out a stack of invoices from Thorne's Freight Company, each one higher than the last, and a series of tax notices from the county, each one a little more threatening. "He is a patient man," she said. "He thinks he can simply wait for me to drown in paper." Jonah looked at the documents, then at her. He understood the precariousness of her position completely. She was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one of social prejudice and one of economic attrition. The sound of a horse pulling up outside broke the stillness. Heavy, purposeful footsteps crossed the porch. The front door opened, and a man stepped inside, his shadow long and imposing in the lamplight. He wore the dusty coat of a long-distance rider and a badge pinned to his vest. "A.U.S. Marshal." "Evening," the marshal said, his eyes sweeping the room and landing on Jonah. He was a tall, grim-faced man with a drooping mustache and pale, assessing eyes. "I'm Marshal Davies. I'm looking for a man. Answers to the name Jonah Wells. Came through here from Arizona. There's a warrant for him. Shooting of a deputy." Jonah didn't move. His hands remained flat on the table, his posture relaxed. But inside, a familiar cold tension coiled in his gut. The shooting had been a messy affair, a saloon brawl where the deputy had drawn first and shot a bystander. Jonah had disarmed him, not killed him, but the story would have been twisted by the time it reached a warrant. Before Jonah could speak, he heard another set of footsteps. Bartholomew Thorne appeared in the doorway behind the marshal, a look of triumphant malice on his face. "Marshal," Thorne boomed. "I believe your search is over. This is the man you're looking for." The marshal's eyes locked onto Jonah. Thorne had seen his chance and seized it, aligning himself with the law to eliminate the man who had publicly shamed him. It was a perfect, legal solution to his problem. Marshal Davies took a step forward. "Son, I'm going to need you to stand up nice and slow and unbuckle that gun belt." This was the moment of truth. All my friend had to do was stay silent. Let the law take this dangerous man out of her life. Thorne would be indebted to her. Her problems would be solved. Jonah looked at her, his expression giving nothing away, but his eyes asked a silent question. My friend stood up. She did not look at Jonah. She looked directly at the marshal, her small frame seeming to gain stature in the lantern light. "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and steady. "This man is Mr. Smith. He is a carpenter I have hired to do some repairs. He has been here for 2 days." Thorne's jaw dropped. "What? That's a lie. His name is Wells." The marshal looked from Thorne's furious face to my friend's placid one. "Are you sure? Lying to a federal officer is a serious crime." "I am quite sure," my friend said, her gaze unwavering. "The man you are looking for, a drifter in black, did pass through. He had a drink of water and rode on yesterday morning. He was heading east, toward the Salt Flats." She was lying. Lying to a U.S. Marshal, directly contradicting the most powerful man in town, all to protect a man she barely knew. It was not a calculation anymore. It was a choice. She had thrown her lot in with him, and in doing so, had slammed the door on any possibility of a peaceful retreat. She had made herself an outlaw's accomplice. Marshal Davies studied her for a long, hard moment. He was an experienced lawman, and he could smell a lie like he could smell rain on a hot wind. But he also saw the unshakable certainty in the woman's eyes and the sneering desperation in Thorne's. He had a long ride ahead of him, and chasing a ghost across the Salt Flats was a fool's errand. "Well," he said finally, turning to Thorne. "Seems you were mistaken." He tipped his hat to my fen. "Apologies for the intrusion." He turned and walked out, his footsteps receding into the night. Thorne stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He shot a look at my fen that was pure poison, then turned and stormed out after the marshal. The silence that descended on the room was heavier than before. Jonah slowly let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at my fen, who was now calmly gathering the dishes from the table as if nothing had happened. He had seen men risk their lives for gold, for land, for pride. He had never seen anyone risk everything for a stranger, for a principle. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice quiet. "You should not have had to fix a wagon wheel that was not broken," she replied without looking at him. "We all make choices, Mr. Wells." 3 months later, the punishing heat of summer had given way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The cottonwood trees along the creek were turning a brilliant yellow. The sign that hung from the front of the inn had been repainted. In neat, clean letters, it now read, "Riley and Wells Boarding House." The business was thriving. Jonah had used his knowledge of the territory to secure a contract for the inn to serve as an official stop for the territorial mail line. The steady income from the mail riders and their passengers gave the inn a stability it had never known. The porch was repaired, the windows were clean, and the smell of my fen's cooking drew customers from up and down the street. They were partners, in business and in life, a fact understood and accepted by the town with the quiet pragmatism of the frontier. Bartholomew Thorne was gone. The day after the marshal left, Jonah had made his way to the telegraph office. He composed a long, detailed message to the territorial governor's office in Carson City. He described the stagecoach robbery, the unique brand on the horses, and the way Thorne used his freight company as a shield for his criminal enterprise. He signed it with his real name. It was a risk, but a necessary one. 2 weeks later, a different kind of lawman had arrived, a federal investigator with a team of deputies who were immune to local influence. They had unraveled Thorne's empire with methodical precision. He was now awaiting trial in a federal jail. One cool evening, Jonah was on a ladder, tightening a loose shutter on the window of room number 3. It had become his room, their room. He wore his customary black, but the fabric was newer, the trail dust washed away. The gun belt hung on a peg inside the door. He still wore it when he rode out, but he no longer lived in it. My fen came out onto the porch below, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She looked up at him, a small smile on her face. Her dark green dress was gone, replaced by a simple blue one, the color of the autumn sky. The rigid set of her shoulders had softened. "Be careful up there," she said. He looked down at her, and the deep, abiding weariness that had been etched into his features for years was gone. In its place was a quiet contentment he had never expected to find. He had ridden into Harmony Creek with nothing but $1 and a history of violence, expecting only a bed for the night. He had found a home. He finished his work and climbed down the ladder. She handed him a mug, and they stood together on the porch, watching the last light of day paint the western sky in hues of orange and purple. Behind the check-in desk, inside the inn, a small frame hung on the wall. In it, polished to a bright shine, was a single, tarnished silver dollar. It served as a quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest risks we take are not in moments of violence, but in moments of unexpected kindness. A person's life is not defined by the storms they ride through, but by the harbor they choose to build, and sometimes, the safest harbor is simply a place where you are seen for who you are, not for what the world believes you to be. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.